Today is February 8th, 2018, and we're at the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans at 3000 Monroe Avenue Northeast, Grand Rapids, Michigan, 49505. We're doing a Veterans History Project interview. This is an oral history interview with James Cook, who was a musician in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam era. Now, Jim lives here at the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans. This interview is being done under the auspices of the History Department at Grand Valley State University, Allendale, Michigan, and is part of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. I, as interviewer and videographer, my name is Wallace Erickson, and I'm a volunteer interviewer with the History Department at Grand Valley State University. We're interviewing James Lee Cook. Jim spells his last name C-O-O-K. He was born August 21, 1944, at St. Joseph, Michigan, and served during the Vietnam era in the U.S. Navy as a saxophone player. He was a musician with the various U.S. Navy bands. Now, Jim, to record it again, could I ask you to repeat your full name, date, and place of birth?
My full name is James Lee Cook. My place of birth was St. Joseph, Michigan, and my date of birth was 08/21/44.
Thank you. I understand you were from the St. Joseph area, in addition to being born there, in that St. Joseph, Michigan, Jim. Where did you live when you were young?
We moved quite a bit when I was younger. My father returned to the States after World War II, and we went to Lansing, Michigan, where my father was attending Michigan State University and finishing up his education that he began before the war. When he graduated from Michigan State, we moved to the Washington State, Tacoma, Washington, where he taught at Tacoma, the College of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. Then we moved to Ames, Iowa, where my father worked on an Atomic Energy Commission project, and then to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We moved to Pittsburgh when I was in second grade, and I lived there until I graduated from high school in 1962.
I see. I might point out that your father was Harold Cook, the late Harold Cook, right?
Harold D. Cook, correct.
And he was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army in World War II.
Correct.
Right. And I had the honor of interviewing him for the Veterans History Project about a year or two, I believe, before he died several years ago. Yeah, that was a fun interview also. So you continue your education then in Lansing from grade school, is that right? Or
no, I grew up, I consider myself a resident of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
That's
and
right.
That's where because I attended school there from the second grade through the 12th grade, graduated from high school.
High school.
In Pittsburgh.
What high school did you graduate from?
It was Baldwin Township High School.
Okay. And when did you graduate? What year?
1962.
Okay. What did you do right after high school graduation?
I went to school at Wheaton, Illinois, at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. It's just west of Chicago, about 25 miles.
So Wheaton College then. Before we forget, how many siblings did you have, brothers and sisters?
At that time, just a brother.
One brother. What was his name?
Thomas.
Thomas. Is he still living then?
No.
I see. What did you study at Wheaton College?
Chemistry. And maybe tennis. I spent more time on the tennis court than I did in the chemistry lab. So,
What, I seem to recall, was that your father's major also in college? Chemistry?
yes,
That's what I thought. All right.
correct.
How many years did you spend there at Wheaton
About
College?
2.
2 years. And where did you go after that?
That's when I was how should I say it? Drafted into the Army, but I enlisted in the Navy.
You got your enlistment in just before the draft notice came, was that right?
No, the draft notice came. I was taking summer classes at Wheaton to make up some credits, and my mother called me, and that was alarming because she did not use the phone. But she told me that they thought they had received what they thought was my draft notice. She hadn't opened it, and she wouldn't open it, and she put it in my drawer, and I could open it when I got home from the classes. So Friday, when I finished my finals, my dad picked me up, and we drove back to Pittsburgh, and I looked at the draft notice, and I was scheduled to report for enlistment that Monday. Saturday morning, I went to the Navy recruiter and enlisted for 3 years in the Navy.
Why did you choose the Navy rather than other branches of the service?
I chose the Navy, to be quite honest, because I thought there was less chance that I'd be cannon fodder in the Navy.
Thought it might be somewhat safer then, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So you signed the enlistment papers, and how soon was it before you actually went off to basic training?
No, it was very short, as I remember, but I'm not sure that the exact time. It just seems to be a short time.
Where did you go for basic training then?
Great Lakes.
In Great Lakes, Illinois then, right? Yeah. And how long did you spend there?
I don't know exactly. I think it was about 6 months. I'm not sure, though, the exact time.
Okay. Do you remember your drill instructors and also your fellow seamen recruits?
No, not at all.
Do you remember what type of people your drill instructors were? Were they rather rigid or very friendly, or?
Well, in comparison to the drill instructors you see on TV, I think that my drill instructor was a softie. And I think that he was, I think that he made sure that we knew what we were supposed to learn, and that he was firm but not abusive. So I guess we would consider him a good drill instructor on that basis. So I don't have any negative thoughts about the man at all.
Okay. Do you remember, or did you make any lasting friendships with any of your other recruits?
No, I think I've had a couple friendships during my, not at the basic, but through the service history, but nothing that continued after the service.
I see. How did you get through basic training?
I just did.
Did your job, right?
Yeah, I did my job. So.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about your experiences later in your Navy service. Where did you go after Great Lakes? Did you go to specialized training, or?
After Great Lakes, I went to Navy Music School in Little Creek, Virginia.
How long was that then, Jeff?
Again, I think that was about 6 months. I don't know exactly.
And did you learn a specific instrument there, or just learn music in general?
We learned music in general, but I had private lessons on 2 instruments because the saxophone players were required to double on clarinet and vice versa. Clarinets would double on saxophone.
So you learned both instruments then, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
And the reason was the bands, particularly the fleet bands, were modeled after big bands, and that was the instrumentation for big bands. The saxophone players doubled on clarinet and sometimes tripled saxophone, clarinet, and flute. So.
By big bands, do you mean the big dance bands?
The big dance
40s?
bands,
Okay.
correct.
Yeah. Did you make friendships then with any other fellow musicians in training there?
There was some just... No, not really. I mean, I had two fellows that bunked near me, and I was familiar with them, and occasionally we'd go out and tip a few, but nothing lasting very long, you know.
Okay. Now, after Navy Music School, where did you go then?
After Navy Music School, my first duty station was Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego, California.
And were you with the Fleet Marine Force at that point, or let me stop? Now, Jim, at North Island, were you further assigned?
I'm not sure about this, but I think that we were bunking at North Island, and we were assigned to a ship at that time, and that was my first cruise. Was on the USS Kearsarge aircraft carrier, and so we may have been every band that went out at that time. Every flagship that went out, and the flag meant that there was an admiral on board, carried a band with him, a 16-piece band, and aboard the ship. And
What do you remember the whole number of the Kearsarge?
No.
Okay. But you were assigned to the Kearsarge and eventually made your first cruise on that.
Made the first one.
Was that the cruise to the Western Pacific then?
Westpac, correct.
Westpac, okay. How long did the cruise last?
About 7 months.
And do you remember roughly what ports you called at? Did you go to Japan and Hong Kong?
We went to Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Mm-hmm. We went to Yokosuka, Japan, Sasebo, Japan. Went to Subic Bay in the Philippines. We went to Hong Kong. And on that cruise, we also went to Singapore. That was at the time of Johnson's visit of Vietnam. His helicopter went to Singapore, and we went to Singapore and picked up the helicopter and transported it back. And I think it was all the way to the States, but I'm not sure about that.
How many days were you in port, or did you have several days in port?
Yeah, we had several days, not very long. It was about 3 or 4 days, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm. Were you able to get shore leave generally on?
Yes, we were.
Was it?
Not to the extent that I would like to. When I was in Yokosuka, I was able to go to Tokyo. And I find myself in a weird situation there. Dressed in civilian clothes, but probably obviously a serviceman because of my haircut and whatever, and ended up in the middle of a very large anti-nuclear demonstration in Tokyo. So.
What, were the civilian authorities in Japan, were they concerned about that at all, or?
No, in a situation like that, I always tried to maintain my cool, and I didn't find anybody there that was threatening or felt uncomfortable with my presence there. So, and I left as soon as I realized what was going on. So.
The Navy, they particularly briefed you folks at all about the upcoming demonstration or anything? Or
No.
was it just something that happened?
No, I just took off.
Okay. Well, you're in the Western Pacific, really about the same time I was in the Western Pacific, and actually in Vietnam. Did you ever make landfall in Vietnam at all?
No.
You ever come ashore?
No, we haven't. That cruise, we were transferred to the AFS-1, the USS Mars, which since I talked to Wally about participating, since I talked to you about participating in this program, I did look up the AFS Mars, and I thought that it was unique because it was the first refrigerated supply ship, but they also called it an attack ship.
Mm-hmm.
Attack freighter, I guess it was.
Do you remember the hull number at all?
AFS.
The USS Mars was, the hull number for that was what?
AFS-1, I think.
Okay. And you mentioned it was a refrigerated
supply ship.
supply
It
ship.
must have been more than that when I look at the ship, because they were, what would you call them? They were set up to do the high lines also. But there was a hangar back there, and then from my reading, there were 2 helicopters on board.
Yeah. When did you join that ship? Then during the
They
Pacific?
transferred us from the Kearsarge. They transferred us by helicopter from the Kearsarge to the Mars,
Mm-hmm.
and then back again.
So there was a temporary duty then on the Mars. How long were you on the Mars?
I think about 2 weeks.
Okay. And again, you played for the sailors and others on the Mars, and then from there you went back to the Kearsarge. Okay. You have any particular memorable experiences while you were at sea in Westpac?
Well, then when I was on the AFS-1 is the only time I was fired upon.
What happened there, Jim?
I was out on what I call it the flight deck. It's not like a flight deck on the carrier because it was helicopters only.
Hmm.
And I had purchased a camera at our last duty station, or at our last port of call, and I was out on the flight deck taking pictures of the helicopter when I heard a big splash and turned around and looked. So then there was another where I could actually see the flame coming out of the barrel of the gun on shore, and then that was it. So we all speculated that the captain was a showboat. It was the first, and that he knew how close he could get without being hit.
So you had
So it was
sailed.
close enough to draw fire, but
How close was that? Any estimate of miles or meters to the shore?
no, I don't. Can't.
Okay. But you did have the experience of
No.
a round coming somewhat near you. At least you could see the splash, right? Fired upon, like you said.
Correct.
And this occurred off the coast of Vietnam. Is that right, Jim? I see.
Correct.
Let me just briefly ask you, other than that one round that came your way, did you see any combat when you were in the Navy?
No.
Okay. Were there any casualties in your unit? Which would be the ship's band, I assume.
No casualties in the ship band, but we saw casualties on board ship, and primarily It'd be those instances where the aircraft was disabled or malfunctioned or whatever. And I've seen them pull wounded pilots from the aircraft.
We ever-
They were the disabled aircraft were the last to land, and they would string a big net up across the deck of the ship, and the pilot would actually fly the aircraft into that net, which would catch the aircraft then.
Keep him on board, hopefully,
Keep him
without
on board.
going off.
Yeah.
Okay. Were you ever a prisoner of war?
No.
Were you ever wounded?
No.
Okay. Did you receive any individual medals or citations when you were in the Navy?
No.
I see. Well, let me ask you just generally a little bit about life in the Navy, particularly at sea. First one is, I guess, how did you stay in touch with your family? Were you able to?
Letters.
Not cell phones or anything like
There
that?
were no such thing at that time. No Skype, no letters, no phones, no internet.
Were you able to see and send letters on a regular basis then?
Yes.
What was the food like on board the ship?
I'm not fussing, I'm not complaining, don't complain, so I don't remember much about the food. I do remember that I think that was the first time I ever had rabbit, and I really enjoyed the rabbit. So I look forward to it when we had the rabbit. I didn't realize we were on.
And your ability to get supplies as you needed them?
There was a store on board ship.
Oh, I see.
So what do you mean by supplies?
Well, generally we're thinking about beans, bullets, and bandages and that sort of thing, but the Navy's a little bit different. But
No, I think there was quite a bit offered to us on the ships, and even including things like watches or what.
the ship store you were talking about, that would be a cash store then, is that right?
Yes.
Where you could purchase
Yes.
toiletries and, like you say,
Cigarettes.
cigarettes and that sort of thing. Kind of like a mini PX then.
Correct. Yeah.
How did you handle pressure and stress then when you were at sea?
What's pressure? What's stress?
Did you relieve it with music?
The only on that cruise in particular, our only duties were to play. Occasionally, we'd have a rehearsal. We would play for underway replenishments. We'd play at stand-down days. We'd have be a barbecue on the flight deck, and we'd play at that time. There was a small group, a combo, that would go down to the wardroom, the officers' mess, and play for the officers. My forte was not jazz, so I didn't participate in that.
I should have asked this earlier, I suppose, Jim, but what was your rate in the Navy in rank?
When I left, it was a second-class musician.
Okay, that's MU2, is that right?
MU2.
Okay.
And I had passed and done all the paperwork for MU1.
I see.
Because I didn't plan to re-enlist, it wasn't available to me.
Mm. Did you do anything particular for good luck when you were at sea?
What do you mean about good luck?
Any activity to maintain your luck, I guess?
No.
Nothing particular there. Okay. How about entertainment among yourselves, among your fellow musicians? Anything you did?
Let's go back to the last question,
Okay.
because there are things that came to mind. The second ship I went on was the Oriskany, and we affectionately referred to it as the USS Zippo, because there was a fire on board that killed 34 members. So you always had that concern in the back of your head about fire, which I think was probably one of the greatest threats on board the ship. Or when we hit typhoon weather and the ship was turning into the waves, it would really lay that big carrier over at quite an angle. And so I was thinking that it was really a bad night to go for a swim. But I didn't do anything that I thought might ward that off. I just tried to deal with it as it came, and most of the time thinking about trying to maintain, not to be rattled by it, you know.
When did you transfer to the Oriskany?
Well, we returned from to the States on the Kearsarge, and I think we had 30 days leave, and we had probably about 3 or 4 months in port before we left with the Oriskany. And we were transferred from San Diego to Alameda by plane, and we boarded the Oriskany in Alameda, and that was really a spectacular departure, because we crossed under, we were manning the rails, and the band was playing, and we went under the Golden Gate Bridge out to sea.
Was the Oriskany now based at Alameda? Or?
I believe it was, yeah.
Okay. So you sailed under the Golden Gate with the band
The Golden
playing
Gate
away.
Bridge.
And where did you go on that cruise? Was that again?
The Westpac cruise
Western
again.
Pacific again. So you did 2 Westpac cruises.
2 Westpac
Okay.
cruises.
Okay. Any particular additional ports you called on that cruise?
No, no,
But generally about the same as you did with the Kearsarge?
no.
You know. How long were you on the Oriskany then?
And I think that was about 7 months also.
Okay. Anything particularly memorable there that happened on the Oriskany cruise?
No. One of those cruises, and I can't remember which one it was, and then there was a fire on the Constellation.
That's Constellation, that's another aircraft
Aircraft
carrier, right?
That killed, I think, over 100 people. And then I was out one day and took a look off towards the horizon, and there was a big column of smoke, and shortly after that we went to general quarters, our battle stations. And then went cruising behind the Constellation to pick anybody. The fellows were jumping off the flight deck, which was about 90 feet above water, into the water.
So you were in the same, the Oriskany was
Yeah.
in the same battle group then as the Constellation. Were there any particularly humorous or unusual events that occurred on that cruise?
No, I can't think of any, no.
How about entertainment? Did you have entertainment from, almost professional entertainers, I'm thinking, that might have come aboard?
Yes, but I can't remember who those were.
Okay. Yeah, like Bob Hope, or we had those in Vietnam, those entertainers.
I did pull, it wasn't a prank, but a retaliation. I can't remember what set me off, but I went and got a bucket of water and threw it over a shipmate's bunk. So he got into bed and the bunk was soaked.
Soaked wet.
So, and I left the quarters and went up on the conning tower and took a book up there, because I felt I better lay low for a couple of days, anticipating that there might be some retaliation. So.
Did you ever find out who did it?
I don't know whether he did or not, but I went back after, I think it was actually, a day, maybe 2 days, and nothing happened, so.
So you seemed to get away with it all right then. Did you take any photographs when you were overseas? Any that you
No.
would have maintained now?
I'm not much of a picture taker. It's
Okay.
it's in the family. My grandfather and grandmother were both amateur photographers, and my father loved to take pictures. But no, I'm not.
Now again, with the ship's band, what was the size of the band on the aircraft carriers?
On the Oriskany, it was a 16-piece band.
And how many officers would they have had? Just one officer then, the band leader, or others?
Both times they were warrant officers, chief warrant officers.
So the CWO would be the band leader, is that right?
Yes.
Band director, okay.
And then there was a first-class petty officer.
What did you think of your fellow enlisted members and the band leader? Any particular comments there?
Let me see, in both of the cruises that I made, I respected the chief warrant officers because of their musical knowledge and ability. So, and that to me was important. Since they didn't bunk with us or whatever, I didn't have much interaction with them other than that. I think we had a party at the warrant officer's house before we left on the Oriskany. But both of the warrant officers, I had a little bit of a run-in with the warrant officer chief warrant officer on the second cruise, because my shoes weren't shiny enough, but I had several of my acquaintances that were real close to him, and they talked him out of it. So
So you survived that.
I survived that, and only did it. I was restricted to the barracks, and at that time, my girlfriend from New York, who was living in New York City, came out to visit me. So we were able to spend time together while the band was off in the desert someplace, playing for functions.
Did you keep a diary at all, Jim, during your
No.
time in the service? Okay. Do you remember when you got out of the service, that day particularly?
No, I don't remember that day particularly. I guess I was relieved, and I was tickled by the fact that it was not a full 3 years, that I was short of 3 years by a couple days. And this day I'm trying to figure out how I left. I was discharged at Treasure Island in San Francisco, and I went to San Diego. And I can't remember whether I went home first to visit my parents or whether I went straight from San Francisco to San Diego. And I remember leaving there with, because of the fact that I didn't know exactly where I was going to go in San Diego and what I was going to do, of being anxious but looking forward to it. I had read an article about the University of California, San Diego in the Atlantic magazine, and while I was still in the service, applied and was accepted at UCSD. So I went to San Diego to go to school there.
What did you study?
A lot of the general requirements of literature and philosophy.
Okay. And did you get a degree then? Or
No.
How long did you stay at?
I was about
UC
there a
San
year
Diego.
and a half.
Okay. Where did you go after that then?
That was about it. I spent most of I went was discharged from the service in '68. My home ports and all my service experience, after Navy Music School was in California, and I stayed working in California until about 2011, when I moved here to be with moved to Michigan to be with my father.
Mm-hmm. You moved here to the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans?
No, it was he was living in Lansing at that time.
Okay.
We came to the home in 2013.
I see. Both of you came at the same time? Okay. Let me back up to California. What sort of work did you do in California then after college?
I started out and I had a job as a projectionist at a movie theater, arts house, and I worked in a nursery and landscape. Had several jobs in nursery and landscape, and one of them, my last job in landscaping, as an estimator for a large union company in San Diego. And while I was there, they taught me how to estimate water, sewer, and storm drain. I went to real estate financing, and then I went to teach music privately. And for about 20 years I taught saxophone, clarinet, and oboe privately.
So all three instruments then you were
All three.
versatile on. You had a comment about the oboe that you taught.
And somebody said that when you walk by the TV and hear the oboe playing, it means either that someone's falling in love or somebody is dying. So.
Now you mentioned you taught privately. Was this through schools at elementary or high school?
No, I taught at a music store, which was really a wonderful relationship at the music store. And they provided me with the students. They'd come to as most people would do when they get into a new neighborhood and they wanted to get music teacher for their child, they would call the music store and ask for recommendations. Or after I had established, I would be on the list at schools as music teacher.
What was the name of the store that you affiliated with?
San Diego County Music Exchange.
It's a good solid name. Did you join any veterans organizations after the war, Jim?
No, I
After
didn't.
your service? Okay. Now, Jim, in later years and after your service in the Navy, did you attend any ships reunions or other
No.
musicians reunions or anything like that? Okay. How did your experience in the U.S. Navy, how did that military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general? Any particular thoughts there?
Well, it was a tumultuous time, and I had a lot of thought and a lot of thinking about the war. It caused a lot of tension with family and friends. I think beginning with, I don't remember the exact timing, but it was sometime in my, when I was at basic training. I had friends that gave me a ride to the Great Lakes, and I was belittled and berated because of the fact that I had enlisted. And to them, the course of action should have been to leave the country and go to Canada or to drink a lot of tomato juice and flunk the physical or whatever, you know. And I had done some thinking about that because I was opposed to the war even from the beginning, and those friends, I gave them the pat answer. That was at that time, I believe, the domino theory. And I had thought to myself, I had never wished for bad health, and I wasn't in feign bad health to get out of the service. And I was concerned that if I did run to Canada, what would be the chances of my ever returning again and seeing my friends and my family. And there was a history of of my family doing what they were asked to do. My grandfathers, my paternal grandfather was a World War I veteran. My maternal grandfather was a World War II veteran. All of my uncles were veterans, and I guess that would be just two. I had one uncle who was not a veteran, and that's because he was a farmer and had a deferment. I was really tickled when my brother was able to get his, who was 5 years younger, was able to get a deferment. He was a conscientious objector. So I've had, at the time I didn't consider myself well informed, but with watching the Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War, I think I was probably better informed than I knew, than I realized, and they really hurt when they talked specifically about the success of the war being measured in terms of bodies and killing. Mm-hmm. And I just feel that, and from my training, I went to a small Christian private school, the Wheaton College in Illinois, where our ROTC program was required, and I had questions about a Christian school requiring ROTC or in any way being associated with the military. So, and it's gone on even to this day, and I see more of it now living here at the home than I did maybe at that particular time. So.
Well, it sounds like you felt it was duty to your country that you joined.
Yes,
and
duty to
served.
my country, and with responsibilities or consequences if I didn't.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jim, you mentioned that you and your father, Harold, came at about the same time to the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans. Was your father's health failing? Is that why he came here? Or any particular reason?
Yes. I moved in with my father in 2011, and at that time he was in need of help. And I was in the situation where I was in a transition at that time. I had no ties to California, and financially and whatever was not a good time for me. So I talked to my father and moved in with my father then. And I'd hoped to be almost his, I tried to be his companion at that time, and there was problems with that relationship because of a cousin and the power of attorney, et cetera, et cetera. But I hoped that my father would consider me a help, during that stay. And it became obvious that my father was going to need full-time assistance, and that's when we decided to move here. So, and I thought it would be a good move for me also. So I'm really thankful for that time that I had to spend with my father, because he was, as I was growing up, was very busy with his work and whatever. and so we didn't spend a lot of time together. My father was, and I don't fault my father for that. He was a good father, excellent father. But it was nice to be able to, and the wartime was a really rough time. I went through a period of time when I had very little communication with my family at all for about 13 years or so. And so it was after, to be able then to spend this time late in his life together was really significant, really meaningful for me. So, and I'll always be thankful for that time we had together. Those were, as far as I'm concerned, a good 3 years. So.
When did the two of you move here then, to the Home for Veterans?
It was in March of 2013.
I see. Now you've been active with various volunteer, quote, jobs, end quote, here at the Home for Veterans, you were telling me. What sort of activity do you do here?
Well, I have 2 jobs. I call them my funky little jobs, and they're with the work therapy program. So I do get some remuneration from my work. The one job, and the one that I really enjoy the most of the 2 of them, is with the laundry. I'm considered miscellaneous, so I guess the story of my life, huh? Miscellaneous. But any laundry that hasn't been processed properly, with or without name, comes to me. I sort it out. If there's a name on it, I verify that the name and the unit number, and bundle it and have it returned to the owner. If there's no owner name in it, I put it in a bin and take all that clothing over to the donation center. So I have a very fine supervisor there, and he's performance-based, so he says, as long as you do your job, you can take any time whatever you need. And so he's never accounted for my time. So I try to honor that by making sure that I have he told me I don't have any deadlines, but I do have deadlines that I've made so that he can say that I'm doing what I'm supposed to. My second little job is making sure that we have 5 flavors of Kool-Aid and milk, and I keep the refrigerators, which at the time when we were in Rankin 2 and 3, that there were 5 different Kool-Aids in 3 different pantries, and the milk also that was maintained. And also I returned dirty dishes. The fellows could take the meals from the dining room and eat them in their room, and then I would return the dirty dishes to the kitchen. So, and that one was not necessarily my favorite job, because the members were supposed to scrape their dishes clean, empty their glasses and whatever, which many times did not happen. And I didn't like being dependent upon the other people to do their job.
Oh, sounds like you're keeping quite active here at the Home for Veterans then. Do you have any other items that you'd like to comment on? Anything that we haven't covered on the interview that?
No, I don't think so. I think you've been very thorough, Wally.
Good. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for your participation and sharing your recollections of your service in the U.S. Navy, and even before and after the military. This interview is being done as part of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. And also it's being done through the History Department at Grand Valley State University, Allendale, Michigan. Jim Cook, I certainly thank you for your participation. And again, my name is Wally, or Wallace is the full name, Erickson. I'm a volunteer interviewer for the Veterans History Project.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.